The German generals laughed the moment they saw who was waiting in the cockpit. 40 minutes later, not one of them could find a single word. April 1945. Dawn spread slowly across the wide concrete runway of a military airfield in western Germany, painting the battered hangars in pale shades of gold, while a cold spring wind swept dust across rows of olive-drab transport aircraft. The war in Europe was nearing its final chapter, but thousands of decisions still had to be made every day, and every flight carried more than cargo. Some carried history, some carried pride, and one carried 7 German generals who still believed they understood everything about war. A line of American military police escorted the officers across the tarmac without haste. Their uniforms were neatly pressed despite weeks of uncertainty, their boots polished from long habit rather than necessity. Even as prisoners of war, they carried themselves with disciplined posture, quiet confidence, and the lingering certainty that rank could never truly disappear. General Friedrich Keller walked at the front of the group. 58 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and once responsible for commanding thousands of soldiers across Europe, he observed everything around him with calm, calculating eyes. Nothing escaped his attention. Not the orderly rows of fuel trucks. Not the mechanics tightening engine panels beneath enormous propellers. Not the American crew chiefs exchanging relaxed smiles before another routine mission. His expression never changed. Behind him, another general glanced toward the waiting aircraft and quietly remarked in German that America certainly had enough airplanes to waste. A few restrained chuckles followed. They climbed the portable steps leading into the transport plane, expecting another anonymous military crew, another young American pilot eager to prove himself before distinguished prisoners. Instead, the cockpit door opened. A young woman stepped into view. She wore a neatly fitted olive flight jacket with captain's bars on her shoulders, her blonde hair tucked beneath a flight cap, leather gloves folded neatly beneath one arm. She carried no dramatic expression, no attempt to impress anyone watching. She simply walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had repeated the same routine hundreds of times before. Her name was Captain Evelyn Carter, 26 years old, born outside Wichita, Kansas. Flight instructor before the Army called upon skilled civilian women to ferry aircraft across the country. She had logged more flying hours than many combat pilots twice her age, though few strangers ever guessed it. One of the German officers stopped halfway to his assigned seat. Another slowly raised an eyebrow before turning toward General Keller with a smile that barely concealed amusement. "So this," he muttered softly in German, "is what remains of the American Air Corps." The laughter spread through the cabin, quiet at first, then stronger as several officers exchanged knowing looks. One joked that perhaps America had finally run out of real aviators. Another wondered aloud whether they should prepare to instruct the pilot if the weather became difficult. Their confidence filled the cargo compartment more completely than the smell of aviation fuel drifting through the open hatch. Captain Carter heard every word. She offered no reply. She did not glance toward them. She did not defend herself. Instead, she checked her wristwatch, opened a worn leather flight folder, reviewed the weather reports one final time, and reached forward to adjust a series of switches with calm, practiced precision. Outside, ground crews removed the wheel chocks. A crew chief raised one gloved hand in silent confirmation. Inside the aircraft, the laughter continued. Evelyn simply fastened her shoulder harness, rested one hand lightly on the control yoke, and stared through the windshield toward the endless runway stretching into the pale morning light. The only person aboard who felt no need to prove anything was the one holding every life on that airplane in her hands. Captain Evelyn Carter wrapped both gloved hands around the control yoke with the relaxed confidence of someone greeting an old friend rather than commanding a machine that weighed more than 20,000 pounds. Her eyes moved across the instrument panel in a familiar rhythm, never hurried, never uncertain. Oil pressure, fuel mixture, magnetos, flight controls, compass, engine temperatures. Every gauge answered exactly as expected. Outside the windshield, a crew chief lowered his signaling paddles and stepped safely aside while the massive propellers gathered speed, their steady rotation becoming a deep mechanical heartbeat that vibrated gently through the aluminum frame. The transport aircraft seemed to awaken beneath her hands. Inside the cargo compartment, The 7 German generals settled into their canvas seats, fastening their safety belts with practiced movements born from years of military travel. They watched one another with restrained amusement rather than concern. General Friedrich Keller glanced toward the open cockpit and quietly observed the pilot's calm routine. She looked too young, he thought. Too composed. Almost ordinary. He had spent decades evaluating officers within minutes of meeting them. Experience had taught him that confidence often concealed weakness. He assumed the same rule applied here. Colonel James Whitmore, the American officer assigned to accompany the prisoners, remained seated across the aisle without interrupting their conversation. He understood enough German to recognize the occasional laughter, but he showed no reaction. Instead, he unfolded a weather briefing and glanced toward the side window. The morning sky still appeared clear above the airfield, but dark clouds rested far beyond the western hills like a distant curtain slowly drawing across the horizon. Spring weather could change quickly. The briefing had mentioned unstable air developing before noon. Captain Carter had already calculated 3 alternate routes before climbing into the cockpit. Preparation, she believed, was simply another form of respect for the people who trusted you with their lives. She pushed the throttles forward a fraction, listening carefully as the engines answered in perfect harmony. Every vibration told a story. Every sound carried meaning. Pilots learned to hear problems long before instruments revealed them. She closed her eyes for only a second, recognizing the familiar rhythm that meant both engines were performing exactly as they should. Then she released the parking brake. The aircraft began rolling slowly across the concrete, guided by smooth pressure on the rudder pedals. Behind her, one of the generals leaned toward another and whispered that perhaps the Americans had chosen this assignment merely for propaganda photographs. Another quietly suggested that the real pilot would surely take over once they reached the runway. Their smiles widened. General Keller did not laugh this time. He simply watched. Something about the young captain unsettled him in a way he could not explain. She had not reacted once. No irritation. No nervousness. No attempt to earn approval. It was as though their opinions carried no weight inside her mind. The aircraft reached the end of the runway and paused. For several long seconds, nothing happened except the steady rumble of the engines and the soft whistle of wind brushing across the wings. Evelyn looked one final time at the horizon, verified the crosswind, adjusted the trim wheel with 2 precise turns, and acknowledged the control tower through her headset. Clearance arrived. She took a slow breath that barely lifted her shoulders, advanced the throttles smoothly to full power, and the transport aircraft surged forward with quiet determination. The runway lights slipped past faster and faster until concrete seemed to dissolve beneath them. Then, with almost effortless grace, the wheels left the earth, and the entire airplane rose into the cool morning sky as gently as if gravity itself had decided to let go. The transport aircraft climbed steadily through the cool morning air, leaving behind the broken airfield, the damaged roads, and the fading scars of a continent exhausted by years of war. Below, rivers reflected the rising sun like ribbons of polished silver, while scattered farmhouses rested quietly among fields beginning to show the first green signs of spring. At 5,000 feet, the ride remained remarkably smooth. The engines settled into a deep, reassuring rhythm that echoed through the fuselage with almost hypnotic consistency. Captain Evelyn Carter kept her attention fixed on the horizon, making only small adjustments with her fingertips, each movement so subtle that the aircraft seemed to guide itself. Years of experience had taught her that the smoothest pilots rarely appeared busy. Inside the cargo compartment, the atmosphere relaxed. One general loosened the collar of his tunic. Another leaned comfortably against the canvas wall beside his seat. The confidence that had accompanied them from the runway gradually returned. General Friedrich Keller folded his hands across his lap and studied the young pilot through the open cockpit doorway. Her posture had not changed since takeoff. She neither shifted nervously nor glanced back toward her passengers. Every motion appeared measured, almost economical. One of the officers sitting beside Keller quietly remarked that the flight had become surprisingly uneventful. Another answered with a smile that calm skies made anyone appear talented. Several nodded in agreement. Colonel James Whitmore continued reading the weather bulletin without joining the conversation. Every few minutes, he looked toward the cockpit, where Captain Carter occasionally reached for a chart clipped neatly beside the instrument panel before returning her eyes to the endless blue ahead. She was comparing the forecast with what she could actually see developing along the western horizon. The clouds no longer resembled harmless spring formations. They were building upward in slow, towering layers, their bright white tops gradually giving way to darker shades beneath. Sunlight still illuminated the cabin through the side windows, but the brightness had softened. The air itself seemed different, quieter somehow, as though the atmosphere were holding its breath. Evelyn noticed the first small vibration before anyone else. It was almost impossible to feel, little more than a gentle ripple passing through the control yoke. She glanced toward the left wing, where thin wisps of cloud drifted faster than expected. The wind at their altitude had strengthened considerably. She adjusted the heading by only a few degrees, avoiding the developing weather while maintaining the scheduled route. Her voice remained calm as she requested an updated report from air traffic control. The reply arrived through her headset moments later. Moderate turbulence had been reported farther west, with stronger conditions continuing to build. She acknowledged the message without hesitation, already considering several options. Behind her, the generals remained unaware of the subtle changes unfolding beyond the windshield. They spoke quietly about air campaigns they had once directed, recalling famous squadrons, experienced crews, and legendary aviators whose names had become part of military history. One officer confidently observed that weather separated average pilots from exceptional ones. Another replied that true command revealed itself only when circumstances became difficult. General Keller listened without contributing. Instead, his eyes returned to Captain Carter. Something about her silence continued to puzzle him. She had heard their conversations before takeoff. She certainly understood that they doubted her abilities. Yet she behaved as though none of it mattered. Not because she wished to ignore them, but because her concentration belonged somewhere far more important than wounded pride. Ahead, the bright horizon slowly disappeared behind a broad wall of darkening clouds stretching from one side of the sky to the other. Sunlight faded across the cockpit glass, replaced by cool gray shadows that spread steadily over the wings. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against the throttle, took another careful look at her instruments, and quietly prepared for whatever the next few miles might bring. The first jolt was so gentle that only experienced aviators would have recognized it as a warning instead of an inconvenience. The transport aircraft rose slightly, settled again, and then drifted sideways on an invisible current of air. A coffee cup resting inside the cockpit shifted less than an inch across a small metal shelf before Captain Evelyn Carter quietly reached over and secured it with one hand. Her attention never left the windshield. The towering cloud bank ahead had grown into something far larger than the morning forecast had suggested. Layers of dark gray rolled upward like mountains built from moving shadows, their upper edges glowing faintly where sunlight still reached them. She had seen weather like this before during ferry flights across the Midwest. It demanded patience, precision, and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. She pressed the transmit switch on her headset. Her voice remained calm and measured as she requested a revised routing from air traffic control. Static answered first. Then a brief response arrived, partially broken by atmospheric interference. Reports from aircraft farther north confirmed increasing turbulence across the region. A slight southern deviation remained available, but the weather system was expanding faster than expected. Evelyn studied the chart clipped beside her seat, compared the information with the compass heading, and made her decision within seconds. She turned the control wheel gradually, avoiding any sudden movement that might unsettle the passengers. The aircraft responded smoothly, banking only a few degrees before settling onto its new course. Inside the cabin, several of the German officers finally noticed the gentle change in direction. One glanced through the small round window and frowned at the gathering clouds. Another looked toward General Friedrich Keller, who had already shifted his attention from the scenery to the cockpit. He recognized disciplined flying when he saw it. Every adjustment came early, before circumstances demanded it. Every correction appeared almost effortless. The confidence he had mistaken for youthful simplicity now carried a different meaning. Colonel James Whitmore folded his weather bulletin and secured it inside his jacket. He looked toward the windshield where the horizon had nearly disappeared behind dark layers of cloud. The sunlight that had filled the cabin only minutes earlier had faded into cool silver light. Shadows stretched across the aluminum floor. The steady hum of the engines continued without interruption, but the atmosphere inside the aircraft had quietly changed. Conversation slowed. The casual laughter that had filled the cabin before takeoff no longer returned. The next pocket of rough air arrived without warning. This time the aircraft dipped several feet before recovering almost immediately. Seat belts tightened across uniforms. Loose maps fluttered gently before settling again. One officer instinctively reached for the armrest beside him, then quickly released it, embarrassed by the reflex. No one spoke. Captain Carter adjusted engine power by a small margin, keeping the propellers turning with steady rhythm while easing the aircraft into a slightly lower altitude where the air appeared more stable. Her movements remained remarkably small. She never fought the airplane. She allowed it to breathe with the wind, guiding rather than forcing it. Outside, rain streaks appeared beneath the darkest clouds in the distance, hanging like gray curtains between earth and sky. A narrow corridor of clearer air remained open ahead, but it would require exact timing to reach it before the weather closed completely. Evelyn checked her watch, calculated ground speed, wind drift, and distance almost instinctively, then rested both hands lightly on the controls once again. General Keller watched in complete silence. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he realized he had stopped evaluating the pilot because she was a woman. He had begun evaluating her the only way a professional aviator could evaluate another. And with every passing mile, that distinction became impossible to ignore. Rain began as a faint whisper against the windshield before growing into countless silver lines racing across the glass. The transport aircraft entered the outer edge of the weather system with surprising gentleness, almost as though the clouds were testing every newcomer before revealing their full strength. Captain Evelyn Carter leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving from the horizon to the instruments and back again in an unbroken rhythm. The artificial horizon remained steady. Airspeed held comfortably within its safe range. Engine temperatures stayed exactly where they belonged. She trusted the instruments completely, but she never allowed them to replace instinct. Years of flying had taught her that the sky often spoke first through small changes that no gauge could immediately explain. A stronger gust pressed against the left wing, encouraging the aircraft toward an uneven bank. Evelyn answered with only a slight correction, no larger than the movement required to turn a page in a book. The wings leveled almost immediately. Nothing about her posture suggested urgency. Her breathing remained slow. Her shoulders remained relaxed. Every motion carried the quiet confidence of repetition rather than improvisation. Colonel James Whitmore watched from behind the cockpit doorway without saying a word. He had flown with experienced military pilots before, and he recognized something uncommon unfolding before him. Most skilled aviators appeared busy during difficult weather. Captain Carter somehow became calmer as conditions grew more demanding. The cockpit never filled with hurried movements or anxious commands. Instead, it became remarkably quiet. The only sounds came from the steady engines, the soft clicking of navigation instruments, and the rain flowing across the windshield like streams running over polished stone. Behind them, conversation had disappeared entirely. The German generals now watched the cockpit instead of each other. Another wave of rough air lifted the aircraft several feet before allowing it to settle again. Seat belts tightened once more, but the transport never lurched violently. Evelyn seemed to anticipate each movement seconds before it arrived. She adjusted engine power almost imperceptibly, allowing the aircraft to move with the atmosphere rather than resisting every change. General Friedrich Keller followed every detail with growing fascination. During his military career, he had evaluated hundreds of pilots preparing for operational assignments. The finest among them shared one characteristic that could not easily be taught. They never appeared to wrestle with the airplane. They listened to it. They understood its language. Watching Captain Carter, he recognized that same quality. She did not command the aircraft through force. She worked with it, respecting the invisible currents surrounding every wing and every propeller. Outside, visibility narrowed as darker clouds surrounded the transport from every direction. The bright fields below vanished behind layers of mist. The horizon dissolved into soft shades of gray where sky and earth could no longer be separated. Evelyn reached toward the navigation chart only once, confirmed her position, and calmly folded it closed again. She already knew exactly where she was. Every heading, every checkpoint, every alternate landing field had been memorized long before takeoff. Preparation had removed uncertainty from the equation. Another report arrived through her headset. Air traffic control advised that several aircraft had requested route changes because of deteriorating weather farther ahead. Evelyn acknowledged the transmission with the same composed voice she had used on the runway. She altered course only a few more degrees, selecting a narrow corridor where the rain appeared lighter and the cloud layers less active. The adjustment was so smooth that few passengers noticed it. General Keller certainly did. He realized that every decision had been made before circumstances became dangerous. She was always one step ahead of the weather, never chasing it, never reacting too late. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he removed his eyes from the storm outside and focused entirely on the woman guiding them through it. Somewhere between the runway and these dark clouds, his assumptions had quietly disappeared, replaced by something far more difficult for any proud soldier to admit. Respect had arrived without asking his permission. The rain gradually thinned until individual drops became scattered flashes of silver sliding across the windshield. Beyond the last curtain of cloud, a brighter patch of sky slowly emerged, first as a pale glow, then as a widening stretch of clear blue that seemed almost impossible after the gray world they had just crossed. Captain Evelyn Carter guided the transport aircraft into smoother air with the same quiet precision that had carried them through the storm. She did not celebrate. She did not relax her attention. Experience had taught her that the safest moment of any flight was never the one that felt easiest. She checked every instrument once more. Oil pressure remained steady. Fuel consumption matched her calculations almost exactly. The engines continued their deep, dependable rhythm, unchanged from the moment the wheels had left the runway. She allowed herself the smallest smile, one that disappeared before anyone could notice. Colonel James Whitmore glanced toward the side window where sunlight had returned, illuminating the broad wings with a warm golden glow. He looked back toward the cockpit and quietly shook his head, not from disbelief but from admiration. During years of military service, he had flown with pilots who relied on boldness and others who relied on experience. Captain Carter relied on discipline. It was less dramatic, but infinitely more dependable. Behind them, the atmosphere inside the cabin had transformed as completely as the weather outside. No one spoke. The silence no longer carried skepticism. It carried observation. General Friedrich Keller rested both hands on his knees while replaying every moment of the flight in his mind. He remembered the first joke made before takeoff. He remembered the confident laughter that had echoed through the cabin. Now those memories felt strangely distant, as though they belonged to another group of men entirely. He had expected to witness hesitation when the weather deteriorated. Instead, he had watched a pilot who anticipated every challenge before it arrived. He had expected nervous corrections. He had witnessed smooth, deliberate decisions made without wasted motion. Most surprising of all, he had never once seen her attempt to prove herself. She simply performed her duty. The aircraft continued eastward beneath widening breaks in the clouds. Far below, long rivers curved through quiet valleys while small American transport columns moved carefully along country roads, appearing no larger than moving dots from several thousand feet above. The world looked peaceful from this altitude. The scars of war seemed almost hidden beneath spring sunlight. Evelyn received updated instructions from the destination airfield. Surface winds remained stronger than normal, with occasional crosswind gusts across the active runway. She acknowledged the report and immediately began calculating her approach. She reviewed wind direction, estimated drift, landing speed, and runway distance entirely from memory before confirming each number against the chart clipped beside her seat. Every figure agreed with the picture already formed inside her mind. General Keller noticed her preparing for descent long before the airplane began losing altitude. He watched her make tiny adjustments to engine power while maintaining perfect balance between speed and attitude. She treated preparation itself as part of flying, not something separate from it. That realization lingered with him. Throughout his career, he had believed excellence revealed itself during moments of crisis. Now he began wondering whether true excellence actually revealed itself long before any crisis appeared. Hidden inside habits, so consistent they became invisible. Ahead, the destination airfield finally appeared beneath scattered clouds, its long concrete runway shining in the afternoon sunlight. The windsock beside the field stretched sharply to one side, dancing in the steady breeze. Evelyn studied it for only a second before gently resting both hands on the controls again. The most demanding part of the journey had not been surviving the storm. It was now approaching the ground with the same quiet precision that had carried every soul aboard safely through the sky. Captain Evelyn Carter reduced engine power with slow, deliberate movements, allowing the transport aircraft to begin its gradual descent toward the airfield waiting beyond the river valley. Afternoon sunlight broke through scattered clouds, casting long bands of gold across the runway, but the windsock beside the control tower continued to stretch firmly toward the east. The crosswind remained steady. She had expected nothing less. Her eyes moved once across the instrument panel before returning to the runway that appeared no wider than a ribbon from several miles away. Airspeed remained exactly where she wanted it. Altitude decreased at a measured pace. Every adjustment came quietly, almost invisibly, as though the airplane understood her intentions before she touched the controls. Colonel James Whitmore remained perfectly still behind the cockpit, careful not to interrupt the concentration filling the small flight deck. He noticed something he had rarely seen outside the finest instructors he had ever flown with. Captain Carter never chased perfection through constant correction. Instead, she established balance early and protected it with patience. Every movement was economical. Every decision seemed to remove work rather than create more of it. Behind them, the 7 German generals watched through the side windows as the ground slowly rose to meet the aircraft. Individual trees became visible. Farmhouses emerged from the patchwork of fields. Trucks crawled along narrow country roads. The silence inside the cabin deepened until even the steady engine noise seemed softer than before. General Friedrich Keller no longer observed the flight as a prisoner evaluating an opposing nation's pilot. He watched with the quiet focus of one professional studying another. During his years overseeing military aviation, he had often reminded young officers that confidence should never be loud. True mastery usually looked ordinary until conditions became difficult. The thought returned to him now with unexpected force. Captain Carter had never attempted to impress anyone. She had simply removed every reason for doubt one careful decision at a time. The runway expanded steadily across the windshield. Evelyn lowered the landing gear. A familiar mechanical vibration passed gently through the aircraft before the indicator lights confirmed everything was locked securely into place. She reduced power once more and adjusted the trim wheel with 2 smooth turns. The transport settled into its final approach as naturally as a bird gliding toward an open field. A stronger gust suddenly pressed against the left wing, encouraging the airplane away from the center line. Evelyn answered with calm precision, applying just enough control to maintain alignment while allowing the aircraft to continue moving naturally through the wind. There was no abrupt motion, no visible tension. The correction seemed almost effortless. General Keller noticed one of the younger officers unconsciously gripping the edge of his seat. He remembered how confidently that same man had laughed before takeoff. Now neither laughter nor clever remarks remained, only careful observation. The runway threshold passed beneath the nose. Evelyn slowly eased the throttles back, while raising the nose by only a few degrees. The transport floated just above the concrete for a brief moment, supported by invisible air, before the main landing wheels met the runway with remarkable gentleness. There was no heavy impact, only the soft, reassuring sound of rubber meeting pavement, followed by the steady roll of tires beneath them. The aircraft remained perfectly aligned despite the crosswind. Evelyn guided it down the center of the runway with patient precision until speed gradually faded and the engines settled into a quiet idle. No one inside the cabin applauded. No one spoke. The silence that followed was unlike the silence before the journey began. Earlier, it had been filled with judgment. Now it carried something far heavier. Every man aboard understood that they had witnessed excellence. And excellence, once seen clearly, rarely left room for another word. The engine slowed to a quiet rumble as the transport aircraft rolled toward its assigned parking area. Ground crew members guided the airplane with bright signal paddles while maintenance trucks waited nearby beneath the warm afternoon sun. The flight that had begun with laughter ended in complete silence. Captain Evelyn Carter completed her final checklist with the same careful attention she had shown before takeoff. Fuel selectors, electrical systems, flight instruments, engine shutdown. Every item received its place. Every motion remained calm, unhurried, and precise. Only after the propellers stopped turning did she remove her headset and gently place it beside the folded navigation chart. Outside, the airfield felt peaceful. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh grass mixed with warm engine oil across the concrete ramp. Mechanics resumed their conversations. Trucks continued moving between hangars. Life at the base returned immediately to its familiar rhythm, unaware that something far more important than a routine transport flight had quietly taken place. Colonel James Whitmore stood first and opened the cabin door. Bright sunlight filled the cargo compartment as portable stairs were rolled into position. The German generals rose without speaking. Their polished boots echoed softly against the aluminum floor as they prepared to leave the aircraft one by one. No one hurried. No one attempted another joke. General Friedrich Keller remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the cockpit, where Captain Carter gathered her flight log and neatly folded her gloves. During the entire journey, she had never once turned toward her critics expecting recognition. She had never defended herself with words. She had answered every doubt with preparation, discipline, and skill. Keller slowly stood and adjusted the collar of his uniform before stepping toward the front of the aircraft. Colonel Whitmore watched him carefully, but noticed nothing unusual except an unexpected seriousness replacing the confidence he had displayed only an hour earlier. Captain Carter stepped down from the cockpit carrying her flight folder beneath one arm. She thanked the crew chief waiting outside, exchanged a few quiet words regarding the weather conditions, and prepared to continue with the next assignment already listed for the afternoon. Ferry pilots rarely remained in one place for long. Another airplane would soon require another delivery. Another destination waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Before she could walk away, General Keller stopped a respectful distance in front of her. The remaining officers paused behind him without speaking. Several American ground crew members glanced toward the unusual gathering, curious but unwilling to interrupt. For a long moment, Keller simply looked at the young captain. His expression carried neither embarrassment nor defeat. Instead, it reflected the careful honesty of a man reconsidering a belief he had held for many years. He slowly removed his leather gloves and folded them neatly in one hand. Then, with measured dignity, he raised his right hand in a formal military salute. It was not offered to an enemy. It was not offered because of rank. It was offered to professional excellence. Captain Carter looked briefly surprised. She returned the salute with quiet respect, neither smiling proudly nor showing triumph. To her, professionalism deserved professionalism in return. Keller lowered his hand and spoke in careful English. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. Captain Carter, before this flight, I believed I was judging a pilot. I now understand that I was only judging an assumption. Today, your discipline spoke more clearly than any argument ever could. Evelyn nodded gently. Safe flights are never about proving someone wrong, General. They are about bringing everyone home exactly as planned. Keller absorbed the words without answering immediately. He realized they described far more than aviation. Around them, the busy airfield continued exactly as before, yet for the men standing beside that transport aircraft, the afternoon had quietly redrawn the line between confidence and wisdom. General Friedrich Keller remained standing for several quiet seconds after Captain Evelyn Carter walked toward the operations building, her flight log tucked beneath one arm, already focused on the next assignment waiting beyond the airfield. She never looked back to see whether anyone was watching. She did not pause to measure the effect she had left behind. The afternoon breeze lifted the edge of her flight jacket as she disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of military life. Another pilot completing another mission with the same quiet discipline that had carried every passenger safely across the sky. Colonel James Whitmore watched her leave before turning toward the waiting transport truck that would escort the German officers to their next destination. None of the prisoners spoke as they climbed aboard. The familiar confidence that had accompanied them that morning had not vanished. It had changed into something steadier, something humbler. During the short drive across the base, General Keller found himself looking through the window at mechanics repairing aircraft, young crew chiefs checking fuel lines, and pilots preparing maps for afternoon flights. Every person seemed focused on the work itself rather than the recognition that might follow. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether greatness was often hidden inside people who never announced it. Later that evening, while the setting sun painted the horizon in soft shades of amber and copper, Keller borrowed a pencil and a single sheet of paper from an American guard. He wrote only a few lines before placing the page aside. The words were simple. They were not intended for newspapers or military reports. They were written as a reminder to himself. Today I met a pilot who never argued against prejudice. She simply flew beyond it. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his pocket. Some lessons belonged in official records. Others belonged only in memory. Across the airfield, Captain Carter prepared another aircraft for another ferry flight. She inspected the wings, checked the tires, reviewed the weather forecast, and thanked the maintenance crew before climbing into another cockpit. To everyone around her, it looked like an ordinary afternoon. No ceremony marked the earlier flight. No audience gathered to celebrate it. She preferred it that way. Flying had never been about applause. It had always been about responsibility. As dusk settled across the quiet airfield, the runway lights began glowing one by one, stretching into the distance like a path disappearing toward tomorrow. Another engine started somewhere beyond the hangars. Another crew prepared for departure. The world continued moving forward, carrying with it people whose names history might never remember, yet whose character quietly changed the lives of those around them. Years later, many stories from the war would be told through battles, victories, and famous commanders. Far fewer would remember a calm spring afternoon when a young American pilot answered every doubt without raising her voice. Yet those who had shared that flight would remember something no report could fully capture. They had boarded the airplane believing authority came from rank, age, and reputation. They stepped off understanding that true authority often arrived wearing quiet confidence instead. The sky had not cared about uniforms, assumptions, or pride. It had responded only to preparation, discipline, and skill. Perhaps that had always been the lesson waiting above the clouds. The loudest opinions had filled the cabin before takeoff. The deepest truth arrived only after everyone fell silent. Because dignity does not compete with prejudice. It simply outlasts it. And the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.